Okay, so let's talk about prokaryotes. So if you remember, there are two main categories of life. There's the prokaryotes, which are a little more simple. These are unicellular organisms. And there's bacteria and the archaebacteria. And there's also the eukaryotes, which includes animals and plants, as well as fungi and protists. But like we said, prokaryotes are more simple, and the way that they divide is actually more simple too. So prokaryotes can reproduce sexually sometimes, but most of the time they reproduce asexually by a process called binary fission. And you don't have to know too much about binary fission, but it is quite simple, so let's just look at it anyway. Remember that prokaryote DNA is found in a circular shape called nucleoid. And for a prokaryote, just like a eukaryote, if they want to divide and make more prokaryote cells, they're going to have to copy their DNA. So they copy this nucleoid and they make a new nucleoid. And then the copies of the DNA are going to move apart from each other before the cell will split. The plasma membrane on the inside towards the middle is going to pinch inward, and more cell wall will be made, which eventually divides this parent cell into two daughter cells. So why is binary fission classified as asexual reproduction? Because it's one cell making a copy of itself. And since this one cell is the whole organism, if it just makes one more cell, that's reproduction. If you, sitting there watching this video, make one cell, you have not reproduced because you need to make a lot more cells than just one if you want it to copy your whole body. But a bacteria can copy their whole body just like this. So first, they duplicate their chromosome, which means they're copying their DNA. The copies of the DNA are going to split apart and move to the left and the right so they can be separated. And we're going to see the cell start to pinch in the middle. And lastly, this is one cell here in this picture still. This is just one big cell. But as soon as it splits, now we have two cells, and they are copies of the parent. So where did the parent go? Did it disappear? Did it die? Not really. It just became two cells. It grew bigger and it split into two. So this is how prokaryotes mostly reproduce. This is a real picture of some transmission electron microscopy of you can see binary fission happening here. You can see the chromosomes are splitting apart. All right. Now let's get into the more interesting stuff that we're going to focus on, which is eukaryotes, which are, in my opinion, way cooler. So first of all, remember that eukaryotes are more complex. They're bigger, they have more DNA, and they have a bunch of chromosomes. Okay, the DNA is not all connected in one big circle. Instead, we have many individual molecules of DNA floating around inside of our nucleus. So just like with the prokaryote, if you want to make more eukaryotic cells, you still have to copy your DNA, right? So let's talk about a couple different names of DNA. Well, DNA is a molecule, okay? It's a nucleic acid. And when it's very thin and loose, we can call this chromatin. And it's very thin and it's not packed together. And the reason for that is because we need to be able to access the DNA using proteins so that we can read the DNA and produce the proteins that the DNA tells us to make. Remember that DNA's real job is to give instructions for making proteins. So when the DNA is loose in the chromatin form, we can actually read the DNA and make the proteins that the DNA tells us to make. Chromosome is another word that we'll need to know, which is a little bit confusing because chromosome technically is, you could call the chromatin a chromosome, but usually when we use the word chromosome, we're talking about the condensed thick versions of DNA. When it condenses, it's easier